Propagation of Knowledge by Rudyard Kipling. The army class English, which included the upper fifth, was trying to keep awake for English literature Augustan epic 18th century, came at last lesson. And that on a blazing July afternoon meant, after everyone had been bathing, even Mr. King found it hard to fight against the snore of the tide along the pebble ridge, and spurred himself with strong words. Since, said he, the pearls of English literature existed only to be wrenched from their settings, and cast before young swine rooting for marks, it was his loathed business in anticipation of the army preliminary examination, which as usual would be held at the term's end, under the auspices of an official examiner, sent down ad hoc to prepare for the form a general knowledge test paper, which he would give them. Next week it would cover their studies up to date of the Augustans and King Lear, which was the selected and strictly expurgated army exam play for that year. Now English literature, as he might have told them, was not divided into watertight compartments, but flowed like a river. For example, Samuel Johnson, glory of the Augustans, and no mean commentator of Shakespeare, was but one in a mighty procession which, at this point, Beadle's nodding brows came down with PG 230, one a grunt on the desk. He had been soaking and sunning himself in the open sea baths, built out on the rocks under the cliffs from 2:15 to 4:40. The army class took Johnson off their minds. With any luck, Beadle would last King, till the T-Bell King rubbed his hands and began to carve him. He had gone to sleep to show his contempt for Mr. King, who might or might not matter, and be for the Augustans, who none the less were not to be sneered at by one whose vast and omnivorous reading, for which such extraordinary facilities had been granted. This was because the head had allowed Beadle the run of his library, naturally overlooked such epigon as Johnson, Swift, Pope, Addison, and the like Harrison, Ainsworth, and Marryat doubtless appealed. Even so, Beadle, salt-encrusted all over except his spectacles, and steeped in delicious languors, was sliding back to sleep again, when Taffy Howell, the leading light of the form, who knew his Marryat as well as Stocky, did his certes, began in his patent noiseless whisper, "Allow me, to observing the most delicate manner in the world, just to hint. Under pretext of studying literature, a desultory and unformed mind would naturally return like the dog of scripture. Ure a damned trencher scrappin napkin carryin, shillin seekin youpin downstairs, Roman 100 Howell breathed." Beadle choked aloud on the sudden knowledge that King was the ancient and eternal Chuckslater, Count Shucksenoff Peter Simple. He had not realized it before. "Sorry, sir, I am afraid I've been asleep, sir," he sputtered. Page 232. The shout of the army class diverted the storm. King was grimly glad that Beadle had condescended to honor truth. So far, perhaps, he would now lend his awakened ear to a summary of the externals of Dr. Johnson as limned by Macaulay, and he read with intention the just historian's outline of a grotesque figure with untied shoestrings that twitched and grunted, gorged its food, bit its fingernails, and neglected its ablutions. The form hailed it as a speaking likeness of Beadle, nor were they corrected. Then King implored him to vouchsafe his comrades one single fact connected with Dr. Johnson, which might at any time have adhered to what, for decency's sake, must Mr. King supposed be called his mind. Beadle was understood to say that the only thing he could remember was in French. You add then the Gallic tongue to your accomplishments. The information plus the accent tease well. Admirable. Crichton, proceed. And Beadle proceeded with the text of an old Du Maurier, drawing in a back number of Punch. To which Howell wooingly, just above his breath, "Oh, want you come up, come up." Result as the tea bell rang 100 lines to be shown up at 7:45 that evening. This was meant to blast the pleasant summer interval between tea and prep Howell a favorite in English, as well as Latin, got off, but the army class crashed into tea with a new limerick. Page 233. The imposition was a matter of bookkeeping as far as Beadle was concerned, for it was his custom of rainy afternoons to fabricate store of lines. In anticipation of just these accidents, they covered such English verse as interested him at the moment, and helped to fix the stuff in his memory after tea. He drew the required amount from his drawer in number 5 study, thrust it into his pocket, went up to the head's house, and settled himself in the big outer library, where ever since the head had taken him off all mathematics, he did précis work and French translation. Here, he buried himself in a close-printed thickish volume, which had been his chosen browse for some time. A hideous account of a hanging, drawing, and quartering had first attracted him to it, but later he discovered the book Curiosities of Literature was its name, full of the finest confused feeding such as forgeries and hoaxes, Italian literary societies, religious and scholastic controversies of old, when men, even that most dreary John Milton of Lycidas, slanged each other not without dust and heat in scandalous pamphlets, personal peculiarities of the great, and 100 other fascinating inutilities. This evening he fell on a description of wandering mad Elizabethan beggars, known as Toma Bedlams, with incidental references to Edgar, who plays at being a Toma Bedlam in Lear, but whom Beadle did not consider at all funny. Then, at the foot of a left-hand page leaped out on him, a verse of incommunicable splendor opening doors into inexplicable worlds from, a song which Toma Bedlams were supposed to sing. It ran. PG 234. He sat mouthing and staring before him till the bell rang, and it was time to take his lines up to King's study, and lay them as hot from the press in the impot basket appointed. He carried his dreams on to number 5, they knew the symptoms of old. "Readin' again," said Stocky like a wife, welcoming her spouse from the pothouse. "Look here, I've found out something." Beadle began. "Listen. No, you don't till afterwards. It's Turkey's prep." This meant it was a Horace ode through which Turkey would take them for a literal translation, and all possible pitfalls. Stocky gave his businesslike attention, but Beadle's eye was glazed, and his mind adrift throughout, and he asked for things to be repeated, so when Turkey closed the Horace justice began to be executed. "I'm all right," he protested. "I swear I heard a lot what Turkey said." "Shut up, oh, shut up, do shut up, you putrid asses." Beadle was speaking from the fender, his head between Turkey's knees and Stocky largely over the rest of him. "What's the meter of the beastly thing?" McTurk waved his Horace. "Look it up." Stocky, 12th of the 3rd. Ionicum a minor. Stocky reported, closing his book in turn. "Don't let him forget it." And Turkey's Horace marked the meter on Beadle's skull, with special attention to elisions it hurt. PG 235. "Got it, you liar, you've no ear at all." Chorus Stocky. Both Horaces strove to impart the measure, which was altogether different from its accompaniment. Presently Howell dashed in from his study below. "Look out if you make this infernal Dinwell have someone up the staircase in a sec. We're teachin' Beadle Horace, he was goin' to burble us some muck, he read the tutors explained. "'Twasn't muck, it was about those Toma Bedlams in Lear." "Oh," said Stocky, "why didn't you say so?" "'Cause you didn't listen. They had drinkin' horns and badges. And there's a Johnson note on Shakespeare about the meanin' of Edgar sayin', 'My horn's dry.' But Johnson's dead wrong about it," Aubrey says. "Who's Aubrey?" Howell demanded. "Does King know about him?" "Dunno." "Oh yes, and Johnson started to learn Dutch when he was 70. "What the deuce for?" Stocky asked. "For a change after his dicker, I suppose," Howell suggested. "And I looked up a lot of other English stuff too. I am goin' to try it all on King." "Showin' off as usual," said the acid McTurk, who, like his race, lived and loved to destroy illusions. "No, for a draw, he's an unjust dog. If you read, he says you're a showin' off. If you don't, you're a Markentin Philistine. What does he want you to do? Curse him." "Shut up, Beadle," Stocky pronounced. "There's more than draws in this. You've cribbed your maths off me ever since you came to call. You don't know PG 236. What a cosine is even now. Turkey does all your Latin. I like that. Who does both your pixiolas? French don't count. It's time you began to work for your giddy livin' and help us. You aren't goin' up for anything that matters. Play for your side, as Heffel says, or die the death you don't want to die the death again. Do you? Now let's hear about that stinkered Johnson swattin' Dutch. You're a sure it was Samivel, not Benjamin. You are so damn inaccurate." Beadle conducted an attentive class on the curiosities of literature for nearly a quarter of an hour. As Stocky pointed out, he promised to be useful. The Horace ode next morning ran well, and King was content. Then, in full feather, he sailed round the firmament at large, and somehow, apropos to something or other, used the word della cruscan. If any of you have the faintest idea of its origin, someone hadn't caught it correctly, which gave Beadle just time to whisper Braun and Mills to Howell, who said promptly, "Hast it something to do with Milson Bran?" Sir King cast himself into poses of stricken wonder. "Oddly enough," said he, "it has." They were then told a great deal about some silly Italian Academy of Letters, which borrowed its office furniture from the equipment of medieval flour mills. And how has our app Howell come by his knowledge? Howell, being indeed Welsh, thought that it might have been something he had read in the holidays. King openly purred over him. "If that had been me," Beadle observed, "while they were toying with sardines between lessons, he dropped on me for showing off." PG 237. "See what we're savin' you from?" Stocky answered. "I am playin' Johnson, member, this afternoon." That too came cleanly off the bat, and King was gratified by this interest in the doctor's studies, but Stocky hadn't a ghost of a notion how he had come by the fact. "Why didn't you say your father told you?" Beetle asked at tea. "My lord, have you ever seen the governor?" Stocky collapsed shrieking among the piles of bread and butter. "Well, look here, Taffy goes in tomorrow. About those drinkin' horns and Toma bedlams you cut up to the library, after tea, Beetle. You know what King's English papers are like. Look out, useful stuff, for answers and well divvy at prep." At prep then, Beetle, loaded with assorted curiosities, made his forecast. He argued that there were bound to be a good many what down abouts. Those infernal Augustine's Pope was generally a separate item. But the odds were that Swift, Addison, Steele, Johnson, and Goldsmith would be lumped under one head. Dryden was possible too, though rather outside the epic. Dryden, oh glorious John, no, that much anyhow, Stocky vaunted. Then Lug and Claude Halcrow in The Pirate Beetle advised he's always sayin' glorious John. King's a hog on Scott too. "New, I don't read Scott, you take this Halcrow chap Taffy." "Right, what about Addison?" Beetle Howell asked. "Drank like a giddy fish." "We all know that chorus, the gentle children." He said, "See how a Christian can die," and he hadn't any conversation cause some one or other. "Guessin' again," as usual. McTurk sneered. "Who?" Cynical man called Mandeville said. "He was a silent parson in a twig." "Right ho, ill take the silent parson with wig and pertinences. Taffy can have the dyin' Christian." Stocky decided. Howell nodded and resumed, "What about Swift Beetle?" "Died mad." Two girls saw a tree and said, "I shall die at the top." Oh yes, and his private amusements were ridiculous and trivial. Howell shook a wary head. "Dunno what that might let me in for with King. You can have it." Stocky. "Ill take that." McTurk yawned. "King doesn't matter a curse to me, and he knows it. Private amusements contemptible." He breathed all Ireland into the last perverted word. "Right," Howell assented. "Bags I the dyin' tree then." "Cheery lot, these Augustins." Stocky sighed. "Any more of 'em been croakin' lately?" Beetle. "My hat, the farseeing." Howell struck in. "King always gives us a stinker halfway down." "What about Richardson, that Clarissa chap, inno?" "I've found out lots about him," said Beetle promptly. "He was the Shakespeare of novelists." "King won't stand that. He says there's only one Shakespeare. Mustn't rot about Shakespeare." To King, Howell objected. "And he was always delighted with his own works." Beetle continued. "Like you." Stocky pointed PG 239 out. "Shut up, oh yes," and he consulted some hieroglyphics on a scrap of paper. "Theth impassioned Diderot. Dunno who he was." Broke forth O. Richardson, "thou singular genius." Howell and Stocky rose together, each clamoring that he had bagged that first. "I must have it." Howell shouted. "King's never seen me breakin' forth with the impassioned Diderot. He's got to give me Diderot, you impassioned hound. Don't upset the table, there's tons more." And his genius was fertile and prodigal. "All right, I don't mind being fertile and prodigal for a change." Stocky volunteered. "King's going to enjoy this exam, if he was the army prelim chap. Wed score. The prelim questions will be pretty much like King's stuff." Beetle assured them. "But it's always a score to know what your examiner's keen on." Howell said, and illustrated it with an anecdote. "Uncle of mine stayin' with my people last holidays." "Your uncle Diderot?" Stocky asked. "No, you ask captain of engineers. He told me he was up for a staff exam to an old colonel bird, who believed that the English were the lost tribes of Israel, or something like that. He'd written tons o' books about it." "All sappers are mad," said Stocky. "That's one of the things the governor did tell me." "Well, near mind, my uncle played up o' course. Said he'd always believed it too, and so he got nearly top marks for field fortification. Didn't know a thing about it either." He said. "Good business," said Stocky. "Well, go on, Beetle. What about steel?" PG 240. "Can't I keep anything for myself?" "Not much." King'll ask you where you got it from, and you'd show off, and he'd find out this ain't your silly English literature, you ass. It's our marks. Can't you see that?" Beetle very soon saw it was exactly as Stocky had said. Some days later, a happy, and therefore not too likable, King was explaining to the Reverend John in his own study how effort, zeal, scholarship, the humanities, and perhaps a little natural genius for teaching, could inspire even the mark-hunting minds of the young. His text was the result of his general knowledge paper on the Augustines and King Lear. "Howell," he said, "I was not surprised at he has intelligence, but frankly, I did not expect young Corcoran to burgeon almost one might believe. He occasionally read a book. And McTurk, too. Yes, he had somehow arrived at a rather just estimate of Swift's lighter literary diversions. They are contemptible. And in the Lear questions thee, were all attracted by Edgar's character Stocky, had dug up something about Aubrey on Toma Bedlams from some unknown source. Aubrey of all people, I am sure I only alluded to him once or twice. Stocky among the prophets of English, and he didn't remember where he got it either. No boys are amazingly purblind and limited, but if they keep this up at the Army prelim, it is conceivable the class may not do itself discredit. I told them so. I congratulate you. Ours is the hardest calling in the world, with the least reward, by the way, who are PG 241, they likely to send down to examine us. It rests between two I fancy martled with me at Ballioland Hume. They wisely chose, the Civil Service Martlet has published a brochure on minor Elizabethan versajourneyman work of course enthusiasms. But no grounding Hume, I heard of lately, as having infected himself in Germany with some transatlantic abominations about Shakespeare and Bacon. He was Sutton the head, by the way, was a Sutton man. King returned to his examination papers and read extracts from them, as mothers repeat the clever sayings of their babes. Here's old Taffy Howell, for instance. He proposed to Diderot's eulogy of Richardson. The impassioned Diderot broke forth, "Richardson, thou singular genius." It was the Reverend John who stopped himself just in time from breaking forth. He recalled that some days ago he had heard Stocky on the stairs of number 5, hurling the boots of many fags at Howell's door, and bidding the impassioned Diderot within break forth at his peril. Odd, said he gravely when his pipe drew again. Where did Diderot say that? I've forgotten for the moment. Taffy told me he'd picked it up in the course of holiday reading. Possibly. One never knows what heifers the young are plowing with. Oh, how did Beetle do? The necessary dates and his handwriting defeated him. I am glad to say I cannot accuse myself of having missed any opportunity to castigate that boy's inordinate and intolerable conceit, but I am afraid it's hopeless. I think I touched him somewhat. PG 242, though when I read Macaulay's stock piece on Johnson, the others saw it at once. Yes, you told me about that at the time, said the Reverend John hurriedly. And our esteemed head having taken him off maths for this precise writing whatever, that Meanches turned him into a most objectionable freelance, he was without any sense of reverence before, and promiscuous cheap fiction which is all that his type of reading means aggravates his worst points. When it came to a trial, he was simply nowhere. Ah well, ours is a hard calling, specially if one's sensitive. Luckily, I am too fat. The Reverend John went out to bathe off the Pebble Ridge girt with a fair linen towel, whose red fringe signaled from half a mile away. There lurked on summer afternoons round the five-skort, or the gym, certain watchful outcasts, who had exhausted their weekly ration of 3 baths, and who were too well known to Corey the bathman to outface him by swearing that they hadn't. These came in like sycophantic pups at walk. And when the Reverend John climbed the Pebble Ridge, more than a dozen of them were at his heels, with never a towel among them. One could only bathe off the ridge with a housemaster. But by custom, a dozen details above a certain age, no matter whence recruited, made a house for bathing, if any kindly master chose so to regard them. Beetle led the low-growing reminder. House, sir, we've got a house now, padre. Let it be law as it is desired, boomed the Reverend John, on which word they broke forward, hurpling over the unstable pebbles, and stripping as they ran, till PG 243, when they touched the sands they were as naked as God had made them, and as happy as he intended them to be. It was half dead smooth, except for the triple line of combers a mile from wing to wing that broke evenly with a sound of ripping canvas, while their sleek rearguards formed up behind one swam forth, trying to copy the roll, rise, and dig out of the Reverend John's sidestroke, and maneuvered to meet them so that they should crash on one's head, when for an instant one glanced down arched perspectives of barrel before all broke in fizzy electric diamonds, and the pulse of the main surge slung one towards the beach from a good comber's crest. One was hove up almost to see Lundy on the horizon in its long cream-streaked trough. When the top had turned over and gone, on one might be alone in mid-Atlantic. Either way it was divine. Then one capered on the sands, till one dried off, retrieved scattered flannels, gave thanks in chorus to the Reverend John, and lazily trailed up to 5 o'clock calover, taken on the lower cricket field. 8 this week, said Beetle, and thanked heaven aloud. Bathing seems to have sapped your mind, the Reverend John remarked. Why did you do so vilely with the Augustins? They are vile padre so's leer. The other two did all right, though. I expect they've been swattin'. Beetle grinned. I've expected that too in my time, but I want to hear about the impassioned Didrot, please. Oh, that was how El Padre, you mean, when Didrot broke forth. Richardson, thou singular genius. Read it in the holidays somewhere. I beg your pardon. Naturally Taffy would read PG 244 Didrot in the holidays. Well, I'm sorry, I can't lick you for this. But if anyone ever finds out anything about it, you've only yourself to thank. Beetle went up to college and to the outer library, where he had on tap the last of a book called Elsie Venner, by a man called Oliver Wendell Holmesall, about a girl who was interestingly allied to rattlesnakes. He finished what was left of her, and cast about for more from the same hand which he found on the same shelf, with the trifling difference that the writer's Christian name was now Nathaniel, and he did not deal in snakes. The authorship of Shakespeare was his themenot, that Shakespeare with whom King oppressed the army class, but a low-born poaching, ignorant, immoral village lout, who could not have written one line of any play ascribed to him. Beetle wondered what King would say to Nathaniel, if ever they met. The real author was Francis Bacon of Bacon's Essays, which did not strike Beetle as any improvement. He had done the essays last term, but evidently Nathaniel's views annoyed people, for the margins of his book it was second-hand, and the old label of a public library still adhered flamed, with ribald abusive and contemptuous comments. By various hands they ranged from rot rubbish and such like, to crisp counter-arguments, and several times someone had written this beats. Delia, one copious annotator, dissented, saying, Delia is supreme in this line. Delia beats this hollow. See Delia's philosophy, page so. And so Beetle grieved he could not find anything about Delia. He had often heard King's views on lady writers as a class beyond a statement by Nathaniel, with penciled exclamation points, rocketing all round it, that Delia Bacon discovered PG 245 in Francis Bacon a good deal more than Macaulay, taking it by and large with the kind help of the marginal notes. It appeared that Delia and Nathaniel between them had perpetrated every conceivable outrage against the head god of King's idolatry, and King was particular about his idols, without pronouncing on the merits of the controversy. It occurred to Beetle that a well-mixed dose of Nathaniel ought to work on King, like a Seidlitz powder. At this point, a pencil and a half sheet of impot paper came into action, and he went down to tea so swelled with Baconian heresies and blasphemies that he could only stutter between mouthfuls. He returned to his labors after the meal, and was visibly worse at prep. I say, he began, have you ever heard that Shakespeare never wrote his own beastly plays? Fat lot of good to us, said Stocky. We've got to swat him up just the same. Look here, this is for English parson. Tomorrow it's your biznai. He read swiftly from the School Lear Act Roman 2, SC2 thus. Now then, my impassioned bard construes that's Shakespeare. Give it up, he's drunk, Beetle declared at the end of a blank half-minute. No, he isn't, said Turkey, PG 246. He's a steward in the estate catton to his employers. Well, look here, Turkey, you ask King if Shakespeare ever wrote his own plays, and he won't give a damn what the steward said. I've not come here to play with ushers, was McTurk's view of the case. I'd do it, Beetle protested, only he slay me. He don't love me when I ask about things. I can give you the stuff to draw Himptons of it. He broke forth into a précis interspersed with praises of Nathaniel Holmes, and his commentators, especially the latter. He also mentioned Delia with sorrow that he had not read her. He spoke through nearly the whole of prep, and the upshot of it was that McTurk relented and promised to approach King next English on the authenticity of Shakespeare's plays. The time and tone chosen were admirable, while King was warming himself by a preliminary canter round the form's literary deficiencies. Turkey coughed in a style which suggested a reminder to a slack employee that it was time to stop chattering and get to work. As King began to bristle, Turkey inquired, I'd be glad to know, sir, if it's true that Shakespeare did not write his own plays at all. Good God, said King, most distinctly. Turkey coughed again. Piously, they all say so in Ireland, sir. Ireland, Ireland, Ireland. King overran Ireland with one blast of flame that should have been written in letters of brass for instruction today. At the end, Turkey coughed once more, and the cough said, it is Shakespeare, and not my country, that you are hired to interpret to me. He put it directly to in PG 247, is it true at all about the alleged plays, sir? It is not, Mr. King whispered, and began to explain on lines that might perhaps have been too freely expressed for the parents of those young, though it gave their offspring delight, but with a passion, force, and wealth of imagery, which would have crowned his discourse at any university. By the time he drew towards his peroration, the form was almost openly applauding. Howell noiselessly drummed the cadence of Bonnie Dundee on his desk. Paddy Vernon framed a dumb played "Oh, well played, sir" at intervals. Stocky kept tally of the brighter gems of invective, and Beadle sat aghast. But exulting among the spirits he had called up for, though their works had never been mentioned, and though Mr. King said he had merely glanced at the obscene publications, he seemed to know a tremendous amount about Nathaniel and Delia, especially Delia. "I told you so," said Beadle proudly at the end. "What him, I wasn't botherin' myself to listen to him," and his Delia McTurk replied. Afterwards King fought his battle over again, with the Reverend John, in the common room. "Had I been that triple ass Hume, I might have risen to the bait. As it is, I flatter myself I left them under no delusions as to Shakespeare's authenticity. Yes, a small drink please virtue has gone out of me indeed. But where did they get it from?" "The devil, the young devil," the Reverend John muttered half aloud. "I could have excused devilry, it was ignorance. Sheer crass, insolent provincial ignorance. I tell you, Gillet, if the Romans had dealt faithfully with the Celt ob initio thisthis would never have happened." "Quite so, I should like to have heard your remarks." PG 248. "I've told them to tell me what they remember of them, with their own conclusions in essay form, next week." Since he had loosed the whirlwind, the fair-minded Beadle offered to do Turkey's essay for him on Turkey's behalf. Then he dealt with Shakespeare's lack of education, his butchering, poaching, drinking, horse-holding, and errand-running, as Nathaniel had described them, lifted from the same source pleasant. Names such as rustic and sorry poetaster, on which last special hopes were built, and expressed surprise that one so ignorant could have done what he was attributed to his own essay, contained no novelties. Indeed, he withheld one or two promising subsequently transpireds for fear of distracting King. But when the essays were read, Mr. King confined himself wholly to Turkey's pitiful puerile jejune, exploded, unbaked, half-bottomed thesis. He touched too on the lie in the soul, which was fundamentally vulgaritized negation of reverence and the decencies. He broke forth into an impassioned defense of mere atheism, which he said was often no more than mental flatulence, transitory and curable by knowledge of lifing, no way comparable for essential enormity with the debasing pagan abominations to which Turkey had delivered himself. He ended with a shocking story about one Jowett, who seemed to have held some post of authority where King came from, and who had told an atheistical undergraduate that if he could not believe in a personal God by 5 that afternoon, he would be expelled as with tears of rage in his eyes. King regretted that he could not expel McTurk, and Turkey blew his nose in the middle of it. PG 249. But the aim of education being to develop individual judgment, King could not well kill him for his honest doubts about Shakespeare, and he himself had several times quoted in respect to other poets, "There lives more faith in honest doubt, believe me, than in half the creeds." So he treated Turkey in form like a coiled puffetter, and there was a tense peace among the Augustans. The only ripple was the day before the army examiner came, when Beadle inquired if he need take this exam, sir, "as I am not going up for anything." Mr. King said there was great need for many reasons, none of them flattering to vanity. As far as the army class could judge, the examiner was not worse than his breed, and the written English paper ran closely on the lines of King's midterm general knowledge test. Howell played his impassioned Diderot to the Richardson lead, Stocky his parson in the wig, McTurk his contemptible Swift, Beadle steals affectionate notes out of the sponging house to dearest Prue, all in due order. There were, however, one or two leading questions about Shakespeare. A boy's hand shot up from a back bench. In answering number 7, reasons for Shakespeare's dramatic supremacy, said, "Are we to take it Shakespeare did write the plays he is supposed to have written, sir?" The examiner hesitated an instant. It is generally assumed that he Roman 999, but there was no reproof in his words. Beadle began to sit down slowly. "Another hand and another voice have we got to say we believe he did, sir, even if we do not. You are not called upon to state your beliefs, but we can go into that at viva voce this afternoon if it interests you." "Thank you, sir." PG 250. "What did you do that for?" Paddy Vernon demanded at dinner. "It's the lost tribes of Israel game you asked," said Howell. To make sure, Stocky amplified, "If he was like King, he'd have shut up Beadle and Turkey at the start, but he'd have thought King gave us the bacon notion. Well, he didn't shut him up, so they're a playin' it again this afternoon, If he stands it then hell be sure, King gave us the notion, either way it's dead safe for us and King. At the afternoon's viva voce before they sat down to the Augustins, the examiner wished to hear, with no bearing on the examination of course, from those two candidates, who had asked him about question 7. Which were they? Take off your gigs, you owl, said Stocky between his teeth. Beetle pocketed them, and looked into blurred vacancy with a voice coming out of it, that asked how heck gave you that idea about Shakespeare from Stocky's kick. He knew the question was for him. Some people say, sir, there's a good deal of doubt about it nowadays, sir. Yees, that's true, but it's his knowin' so much about legal phrases. Turkey was in support a lone gun, barking somewhere to his right. That is a crux, I admit, of course. Whatever one may think privately, officially Shakespeare is Shakespeare. But how have you been taught to look at the question? Well, Holmes says it's impossible he could. On the legal phraseology, alone Sir McTurk chimed in. PG 251. Ah, but the theory is that Shakespeare's experiences in the society of that day brought him in contact with all the leading intellects. The examiner's voice was quite colloquial now. But they didn't think much of actors then, sir, did they? This was Howell cooing like a cushat dove. I mean, the examiner explained the status of the Elizabethan actor in some detail ending, and that makes it the more curious, doesn't it? And this Shakespeare was supposed to be written plays and actin' in all the time, McTurk asked with sinister meaning. Exactly what lots of people have pointed out. Where did he get the time to acquire all his special knowledge? Then it looks as if there was something in it, doesn't it, sir? That, said the examiner, squaring his elbows at ease on the desk, is a very large question which… Yes, sir, and half a dozen eagerly attentive keys. For decency's sake, a few Augustan questions were crammed in concentrically about the last 10 minutes. Howell took them since they involved dates, but the answers, though highly marked, were scarcely heeded. When the clock showed 6:30, the examiner addressed them as gentlemen and said he would have particular pleasure in speaking well of this army class, which had evinced such a genuine and unusual interest in English literature, and which reflected the greatest credit on their instructors. He passed out the form upstanding, as custom was. He's goin' to congratulate King, said Howell. Don't make a row, don't make Canis, or else y'all wake the baby. Page 252. Mr. King of Balliol, after Mr. Hume of Sutton, had complimented him, as was only just before all his colleagues in common room, was kindly taken by the Reverend John to his study, where he exploded on the hearthrug. He thought I had loosed this thigh's rancid Baconian, wrought among them. He complimented me on my breadth of mind, me. Being abreast of the times, you heard him, that's how they think at Sutton. It's an open sty, a lair of bestial. They have a chapel there, Gillet, and they pray for their souls. His particular weakness apart, Hume, was perfectly sincere about what you'd done for the army class. Hell report in that sense, too, that's a feather in your cap, and a deserved one. He said their interest in literature was unusual, that is all your work, King. But I bowed down in the house of Rimmon, while he baconized all over Mepper devil of an usher, that I am, you heard it, I ought to have spat in his eye. Heaven knows I am as conscious of my own infirmities as my worst enemy can be, but what have I done to deserve this? What have I done? That's just what I was wondering, the Reverend John replied. Have you perchance done anything? Where, how? In the army class, for example. Assuredly not my army class. I couldn't wish for a better, keen interested enough to read outside. They're allotted task intelligent, receptive, they're a head and shoulders above last year's. The idea that I forsooth should even by inference have perverted their minds with this imbecile and unspeakable girl school tripe, that Hume professes you at least know, that I PG 253 have my standards, and in literature. And in the classics I hold maxima debetur puris reverentia for. It's singular, not plural, isn't it, said the Reverend John, but you're absolutely right as to the principle. Ours is a deadly calling, King, specially if one happens to be sensitive. PG 255.